Hello, you're listening to the Drawing the Ideal Self podcast, episode 49, and this is in February 2025. So this is going to be a very short explanation of something that I found in one of the books, and it's about loosening. The book this is in is worth reading even though it's old. It's called Personal Construct Theory and Mental Health, and it was edited by Eric Button. It's actually written in 1985, which is a very long time ago. So when you read it, you have to bear in mind the way people were construed at that time, and mental health was construed at that time, and learning disability was construed. So it was quite a different world in those days. However, what is said about the theory in here is really useful. One of the papers is called Schizophrenia, What is Loose in Schizophrenic Construing? And it's by Van den Bergh et al. I'll put the reference in the show notes. If you're not very familiar with PCP, you probably won't know that actually the loosening that you might see in schizophrenia is one of the things that's been a really useful thing that's come from PCP into the world of psychosis, because it's about what is going on in the person's construing system. That's a much more useful thing, and Don Bannister was the person who was first really looking into this in detail, and what he was noticing that what people were saying when they had lost touch with reality weren't random things, that they had some connection. So a lot of the people might have a lot of fear, for instance, and we know now from much more modern research that actually if you looked in people's histories who end up with the diagnosis of a psychosis, you'll find a high rate of bullying in their childhood. If you feel like that you are threatened and at risk, then what might happen is over time and over repeated experiences, you might end up feeling that the world is a much more scary place and you no longer know what to be afraid of, and therefore you might be afraid of everything, or you get some ideas that certain things are particular and they are the things to be worried about. So in 1981, Boeck, who's one of the authors of this paper, analysed Kelly's statements about loose construing and picked up 4 particular characteristics. And that's what we're going to go through now, because this might be useful in the long run for you to understand what loose construing is. I found it very helpful actually. So the first one of those is loose construing means instability in the assignment of elements to construct poles. The allocation of elements to construct poles is varying from one moment to another. Now, we don't usually construe like that. We usually have an idea of which pole something fits with, and it stays around that pole. We don't switch right to the other pole. So remember that elements are the things that constructs are applied to, and they can be absolutely anything. They can be an experience, a person, a thing, a moment, or whatever. So elements are construed, and in this case, elements are being assigned to one pole of the construct or another. So you might say something is either enjoyable or dull, and you would be pretty consistent in the way that you use that. You'll be sometimes assigning things to the opposite pole from the one you would normally use. Now, if that happens, that's actually quite frightening. So if you think of something like a person with dementia, their construing might be very loose, and they're not sure whether somebody is a stranger or not, and they might apply the stranger construct variably, so that sometimes a person is a stranger and sometimes they know that that's their son. When they think the person is their son, they're okay with them. When they're thinking that the person is a stranger, they are not okay at all and might even attack them. They go on to say, in loose construing, the application of constructs is extended. This means that the range of convenience is broadened to include elements to which the construct does not normally apply. So that construct is being used more widely and applied to things that it wouldn't normally be seen as relevant to. So for somebody with OCD, they might have started off just with the idea of, if your hands are dirty, they may be contaminated. I mean, this is particularly common during the pandemic. People learnt about contamination in a different way. But now, in terms of an OCD kind of response, that's got out of control and it's very loose construing. So that construct is applied to all kinds of things as potential contaminants. So pencil cases, kittens, clean cutlery, dressing gowns, it could be anything. But they've gone way outside where contaminated is particularly useful, because they're now applying it to things that don't actually have a high level of risk, whereas hands not being washed when you've touched somebody who's ill could be a risk. So those constructs about contamination have become so loose that they can be applied very easily and very widely, but they're being applied to things outside the usual range. The third one is loose construing is only approximative. Events are not construed precisely, but as rough approximations. So if you think of somebody who might be very anxious in social situations, they might construe people as not wanting to be friends with them. And if somebody says, well, how would you know that? They might say, I don't know. I just know. I just know they're not going to like me. They're not going to want me to be there. So that loose construing is getting them into trouble because they're not looking carefully at evidence and picking it all up. They're applying their construct about people won't want to be with them or won't want to be friends with them. And it's become very wide, but it's not precise. Another example might be a person with dementia who has a loose sense of time, and they've got a loose sense of what events follow each other. So when they wake up in the morning and they're hungry, they know that means it's time to eat, but it's still dark. So they think, okay, it's dark outside, it must be dinner time. I'm going to roast a chicken. And they've got a kind of loose sense of time and a loose construing of what fits together that's meant that actually they're not quite sure what to do, so they make their best guess. Or, of course, they might be certain that they know what to do, and they still make that same guess. And the fourth thing that's really important about this is that loose constructs retain their prior identity. A loosened construct is still a construct in the person's construct system. It remains contrasted with its opposite pole. Only the way it is applied to elements and its relationship with other constructs has changed. So the construct remains the same. So if you think of something like construing things as sad, that what might happen is more and more experiences are construed as sad. So other people are construed as sad. Facial expressions are construed as sad. Animals are construed as sad. So that the person is surrounded by sadness, but that construct still has the contrast it had before. So in this case, it could be that they said, well, the contrast is happy. I want to be happy, but I'm surrounded by sadness. Now they go on to say, well, what happens because of this loose construing? And they say, because of the correspondence between construing and predicting, these four characteristics of loose construing are applicable to loose predicting as well. First is that loose construing leads to varying and inconsistent predictions. It leads to predictions concerning events from outside the range of convenience, while irrelevant events may be taken to validate certain predictions. Thirdly, it leads to approximative predictions. But fourthly, the construct will nevertheless still be used as a basis for predictions. So loose constructs are still used. And why do we use them? Because that might be all we have. That's the best we can do. And the only way that we have to construe the world is to apply the constructs that we have. And if our constructs happen to be very loose, then that's what we're going to use. And one of the things we might be trying to work with somebody on is to tighten those constructs so that, for instance, they can see that they're not surrounded entirely by sadness, that there are glimmers there of experiences that aren't indicative of sadness, that might be neutral, or that might be something that has a different name, even if they're not happy. So we might try and tighten that construct with them and help them to apply it in a slightly different way. So this analysis of Kelly's statements by Boeck, I think, is really quite useful to us. And it might be something you want to bookmark somehow so that you can come back to it. So just to go over again, loose construing is going to lead to varying and inconsistent predictions, and it will take in events and experiences that are outside the range that are normally covered by that construct, or they'll include things that can be taken to validate a prediction but wouldn't normally be seen as relevant. So you can see that if certain constructs are very loose, it's going to cause you quite a lot of trouble. And in particular, if you've got a loose construct about safety and danger, that could be very dangerous for you because you might see danger everywhere. And if you do that, you might react as if everything is dangerous, in which case you're going to find yourself in a lot of trouble. I'm thinking about some of the young people that I've worked with who might construe a lot of experiences as kind of risky for them, their sense of self, and therefore they'll be squaring up to people and shouting back at people and acting as if everything's very threatening. If we can help them to tighten up their constructs so that they don't see that in their world quite as extensive as it is, then that might help them to have some moments where they're not responding in that kind of a way. And loosening and tightening, I think, are one of the most important things that we would be using therapeutically with people. And we'd be trying to help people to loosen and tighten. Sometimes the construing is so tight that actually that's leading to trouble. So, for most of us, we have a nice variation, and we can loosen our own constructs and tighten them again. Depending on the situation and what's happening, we'll be able to respond to most situations. But for some people, they get a bit stuck. And it's those people who are stuck who come for help with these kind of things. So have a think about this and about the people that you're working with and whether their construing system seems extremely loose or extremely tight. If it's extremely loose, you might want to work with them to tighten. If it's extremely tight, you might want to loosen some things. Obviously, it's their choice about what you're tackling and why that would make sense to them to do that. So I hope that's some food for thought and help to clarify a few things to do with loosening. I think it's really a very nice summary. So have a think about it, and I will see you again at the end of March. Thanks for listening. Bye.